So now let's start to talk about what happens when these sort of muscles and joints don't work properly or don't move properly. And when we talk about any type of shoulder problem, as far as, for example, bursitis, rotator cuff problem, labrum joint problem, any of the case that we might talk about, we can essentially divide these into two general categories. One being muscle pain. This would be meaning that the pain that you're feeling in the shoulder is generated from the muscle itself, so that's the pain generator. The second would be what we call a mechanical joint pain. So in this case, the muscles themselves aren't necessarily painful. You can poke and press on them and contract them, they don't cause pain. But because of how they're working, the shoulder is moving a little bit improperly, and that puts extra stress on that shoulder, and that's going to either compress or pinch or sort of strain other more passive structures, whether we're talking about ligament or bone or labrum or these type of things. And if you don't know what I'm talking about with those, we're going to get into them as well. But the concept here is there's two basic categories. And what we're also going to find is all of this mechanical joint pain is also caused by problems in the muscles. So let's talk about this first, and then it'll naturally flow into this mechanical joint pain. Okay, so when we talk about muscle pain and injury, again, we're going to break this down into two things. When we hear about muscle pain, usually we think about things like strains, sprains, strains, tears, this type of thing. And that's kind of what we generally would classify as what we call macro damage, right? So this usually comes from a single event or a traumatic type of injury. This is the type of thing where my shoulder hurts because of X or Y or Z. You can usually pinpoint this back to a specific sort of time or event. Now what happens with this is you basically get tearing of muscle fiber. So just to use this just as an example, if we have a baseball player, for example, and they're going to pitch, I mean, there's a lot of strain on that shoulder. Muscles are producing a lot of force, and if that force exceeds those muscles' tolerance, then you get literally a tear in this muscle. Now, as far as how big the tear, it can be 10%, 20%, it can be a sort of a complete tear, whatever the case is, but the concept's all the same. We actually get fiber disruption in muscles. Now what happens with this is then we have sort of bleeding and disruption, so that's an injury. That itself is going to be painful, of course, and for a period of time, you're not going to be able to use that muscle very well, of course, right? It's just disrupted and injured and inflamed. More importantly, what we want to talk about is how the body actually heals that, because that's a significant sort of thing. So hopefully everybody can see this okay. If you look at any muscle in the body, everything's more or less the same from an anatomical perspective. Muscles are composed of thousands of these individual muscle fibers, kind of in three dimensions. Think about it as different fibers in a rope. So it's all this sort of, this group of fibers. Individually, these are very weak, but collectively they're very strong and they can produce a lot of force and tension. With a tear, you get ripping of these muscles. Right, so there's basically kind of a gap or a hole. Now, that's bad, of course, for the body. So the body has to repair this, and it does so by putting down new connective tissue into the area. Essentially, you can think of this as the body sort of plugging that hole and making those continuous again, if at all possible. So it puts what we call sort of a scar tissue adhesion in here. This is just new connective tissue. It's kind of like a glue we can think of to fill that gap. Now, this is good in the sense that it accomplishes a problem. The tissues themselves are no longer painful. So this might take anywhere from weeks to months, depending on the severity of the tear. When this happens, okay, this muscle itself is no longer painful. You can press on this for the most part. It might be tender, but it's not overly painful, and you can usually contract it fairly well. Here's the problem. This is not the exact same sort of structure that it was before it was injured, because this is kind of like a glue in that area. And remember we said normally all these fibers need to be able to stretch and slide on each other. This is an important part of how muscles work, any muscle in the body. When this is in there, this is very sticky. Like I said, it's kind of like a glue, and this kind of binds stuff together. Now this can't slide properly, so it can't work. Essentially, this can't stretch properly, and it can't contract properly. So we have a flexibility and a strength issue. This has sort of a number of consequences. First of all, this muscle is not going to be able to work as well wherever this tear is, okay? It's going to have one of two things. Either the body's just going to shut this down. It's sort of smart enough to know I can't use this muscle very well. Now it has to use other muscles to compensate. Muscles can compensate a little bit, but not perfectly. So it's going to have some type of mechanical sort of difference in the shoulder. We'll talk more about that later. Let's just get the concept for now. The second thing that can happen is it makes the rest of these fibers do more work, because half of the muscle, let's say, is not able to do its thing. This puts more strain on this area, and this makes it more prone to more injury, insult, that type of thing. All right, so this scar tissue is a big deal. We're going to talk more about that. But does the general injury concept as far as what happens make sense? Pretty clear? Okay. The next thing we need to talk about is what we call microtrauma. So a lot of shoulder problems, when it's sort of that traumatic type of thing, it's at least pretty straightforward as far as what happened. There's a pretty clear event, like I said, it's X or Y or Z, and then my shoulder started hurting. A lot of shoulder problems, in fact, the majority of these are kind of my shoulder hurts, what you do, I don't know. It just kind of started hurting, gradually building over time, not really doing anything out of the ordinary, it just kind of crept up on me and now it's staying there. So as far as the muscles are concerned, when you're doing any type of work with the shoulder that's sort of heavy load or it's repetitive, okay, whether it's, say, swimming, throwing a baseball, a lot of times occupational stuff, poor posture, or using a computer at work, when these muscles are just on, they're at a low level, and that amount of work that the muscles are having to do is not so much that it's causing injury, but it still puts a little bit of strain on them. And it creates what we call micro damage in this muscle. So we still get a little bit of fiber disruption. All right, but instead of being that tear, we might get sort of a very small percentage of these fibers to be kind of injured. We're going to be talking about 0.1% or even less. So it's a very, very small amount. You don't notice this. This is a normal and necessary part of what the body does. It's just the body breaks down and then heals itself. The problem is that this still has to be repaired. The body does the same thing and puts a little bit of new tissue in there. Again, no big deal because it's on such a small level. The problem starts to arise when we're doing the same things over and over and over again, which we tend to do for a lot of things. Whether we're talking about, again, swimming, throwing a baseball, athletic training, at work, if we're doing the same things in the garden, we tend to be creatures of habit. So if we're doing the same things over and over and over the course of months and sometimes years, you're essentially getting more of this micro damage in this muscle and more of this healing. So over time, this actually just accumulates, because once the scar tissue is in there, by itself, it doesn't go away. So essentially, we start to have a very similar condition to what we talked about with that healed tear, what we had before, where we have this adhesion in there. And again, we start to have a functional problem in the muscle. We have a loss of strength, a loss of flexibility. And again, we start to have the body compensating for all these different types of things. This concept makes sense as just a, like I said, a general concept. Good. So, again, the other thing is, to a point, you're not going to notice it. It's going to build up to the point where either this itself can start to cause the muscle to have to work hard and become strained and injured, okay? Or as this gets sort of overused and the scar tissue builds up, it actually makes the muscle weaker. So a lot of times with sort of those so-called acute pains that we talked about before, when it happened from, you know, X or Y or Z, a lot of times this was going on previously, making us weaker and more prone to a problem, right? This is what you see all the time with, you know, baseball pitchers and stuff like that. We hear this all the time, rotator cuff problems and whatnot. These guys are throwing, hundreds of pitches over the course of a game, and over the course of, you know, a lifetime or a season. I mean, we're talking about thousands of throws, and that's a pretty violent motion for the shoulder, right? So one of these throws is going to cause pain, but it wasn't that one throw. This is the type that builds over time. So that's kind of the concept, and the same thing happens with our lives as well. Common muscle and shoulder problems. So again, we talked about this rotator cuff strain, rotator cuff tendinopathy, or tears. I mean, these are just a big group of muscles, or a big group of problems, and those are kind of the mechanisms. Same thing happens with what we call this sort of levator or trapezius strain, this sort of upper shoulder where the neck meets the shoulder. These type of things get sore and injured all the time. Well, that's the mechanism behind it, right? So the mechanisms or how this happens is all the same. The only difference is on what specific tissue or what spot of that muscle is sort of generating that pain at some point.